I'll let you get on with the talk. Thanks so much.
Okay, super. Well, thank you for this to Ella and the rest of MBR. So, in the context of my talk, I'm reaching migrants as a new dimension of my research, and I'm starting to explore this both out of a personal interest. As I said, wherever I go, I seem to be facing this issue of migration in the media, in politics, in social discourse and social narratives, but also because in the case of Colombia, it's a challenging issue that, as I said, adds on to a range of layers of conflict that we have had, that stem from our own internal armed conflict. But now, because we have this issue with Venezuela, it becomes such a new complexity. So let's start with the first slide. Ella, if you can move to the next slide, please. And with this first slide, the first, I think, and the context in which this migration is occurring, we are seeing that the Venezuelan crisis countries are not really ready for the dimension and sort of the challenges that it brings. And in that sense, you have to understand that a lot of the countries that are neighboring Venezuela is on internal armed conflict, right? So in that sense, the images, as you can see, show how very unprepared this caught us back in 2015, and the need for our governments and our societies to try to adapt, but bringing a lot of barriers, both for the migrants themselves and for the internal issues that we've already had to face. So you can see the figure there. We have had around 5.4 million migrants leaving Venezuela since 2015. And according to estimates and figures, by the end of this year, we should see around 7 million migrants already leaving the country. In the case of Colombia, the picture that you see there is in Cucuta, and it is the entry point from Venezuela to Colombia. You can see that this is a particular added challenge for us. Colombia has received around 1.7 million immigrants, out of which around 766,000 have a legal status, but around 984,000 are deemed as irregular. So in that sense, there's a concern about their registration, about the way they're entering Colombia, and particularly about how do we deal with them initially through the legal system and the migration policies, but apart from that, how to deal with them within our economic system and our social political realities. Can we move on to the next slide, please? So the image that you're about to see comes from the International Crisis Group and their reports on the situation, and it's just to kind of show the dimension of this situation. So the Colombian-Venezuelan border is about 2,219 kilometers long. A lot of it is on inhospitable territory. So there's a lot of plains, a lot of jungle, rivers crossing through those areas. So it's not all a place of easy access from Venezuela to Colombia. But apart from that, many of the municipalities, the regions that are located in that border have no state presence or have very little state presence. And instead of having state actors over there, what you have is the presence of illegal groups. So you have their guerrillas, insurgencies such as FARC, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or ELN, the National Liberation Army. These are armies that have been in Colombia since the 1960s. FARC has been demobilized and signed a peace agreement, yet has a range of dissidencies that still operate under that region. And ELN, it's a guerrilla that is very active. It's still engaged in violence against the state and has not had yet a peace process with the government. And apart from that, the region is also hosting a range of smugglers, people engaged in contraband and drug trafficking outside of the guerrilla groups. So actually, as you can imagine, crossing the border is not as easy as it sounds. It's full of danger, it's full of peril, and it's in many areas, it's sort of a no man's zone. It's a very complicated place to be. Let's move to the next slide. So the issue of immigrants in Colombia adds to an already existing problem regarding our internally displaced people. Right, so as you can see from the graph on the right of the picture, we've had victims of forced displacement since the 80s, and this particularly suffered due to the escalation of conflict from the mid-90s onwards, and you can see the rise in figures. And despite it being slightly controlled since 2010, it is still an ongoing issue because Colombia is still a country in conflict. So the point with this is we have around 5.6.7 million internally displaced people in the country. These are individuals that have moved from regions within Colombia, finding shelter in the big cities, mainly, escaping violence, escaping the guerrilla war, escaping sometimes the actions of the army, of paramilitary groups. And in that sense, we already had a challenge with internally displaced people before we even had a challenge with immigrants from Venezuela. So you can see that this is a problem that we've been struggling for quite a long time. The policy for dealing with IDPs back in the early 2000s ranged from very slight offers of aid. At some point, there was an offer where the heads of the families of IDPs would receive 3 minimum wages for a period of 3 months, and that was it. But apart from that, there's a problem on creating refugee or IDP returns. Getting these people to return back to regional regions is impossible because there's still violence going on, because their lands have been taken and now are owned by different illegal armed actors. So actually thinking about a returns policy for many parts of that history of conflict have been really, really complex. So the point here is the complexity of IDPs, and now we add to that the complexity of Venezuelan refugees. So you can start imagining how difficult this is getting just out of the combination of the Colombian issues of armed conflict and the issue of Venezuelan refugees, right? Let's move a little bit, let's move to the next slide. Now with this slide, I'm going to set up sort of a case study, a brief example of something that's been going on in the last 2 weeks, just to kind of bring a recent scope. So the places in red is a municipality called Arauquita, and this is located in the department, or a department in Colombia, sort of what a canton is in Bosnia or what a state is in the United States. This is the Department of Arauca. And you can see at the right sort of the figures regarding the COVID-19 situation at the moment. So Arauca hosts around 5,736 cases. This is last week's information, and it has seen around 173 deaths. But this particular town, Arauquita, right, which is here right at the northern tip, you can see the little black dot. It remains quite isolated because it's kind of distant from the capital of the region, and at the same time, the environment around it permits it to be sort of isolated from certain neighboring towns. But despite that, and perhaps you can move to the next slide, on the north of Arauquita in Venezuela, there have been clashes between ELN and locals and the Bolivarian Guard, the Venezuelan army. And this has created in the last 2 and 3 weeks a huge process of migrants moving from nearby towns of Venezuela to Arauquita. So this has caught, again, Arauquita by surprise. And it currently is hosting around 4,700 to 5,000 refugees, out of which it has around 1,700 children, as you can see there on the information in the slide. Now, most of them are fleeing conflict between Colombian guerrillas and the Venezuelan security forces. And at the same time, this region is now receiving Colombian internally displaced people. So it's immediately receiving these two sources of displacement, sources of migration. And as of last week, now it has started reporting rise in corona cases, being a region that was privileged up to a certain point due to the fact that it was isolated and it did not suffer from any cases throughout most of last year. So you can see how this becomes now a new problem for the local inhabitants, a new problem for the authorities to try to deal with this, and of course an example of how unprepared most levels of governance are here to deal with this type of crisis. Okay, so this is just to show you an example of current issues, current events that highlights the dimension of how towns are dealing with the migrants. Let's move to the next slide. So my point in the article is based on two things. I call it Venezuelans being stuck between a rock and the rock being the fluctuating policy of the government and how to deal with the crisis, and the hard place, sort of the social attitudes and the relation between Colombian society and these migrants, right? So the part of the rock, the rocky response to the crisis, the measures have fluctuated between supporting immigrants arriving to Colombia, whilst at the same time having a very harsh discourse against Venezuela, which creates varying degrees of support, but also varying degrees of obstacle to those people trying to cross the Venezuelan border into Colombia. And there are two kind of structural elements to this that are important to explain this crisis. One has to do with Colombia's peace process and the relationship that this process establishes with Venezuela. And the other one has to do with the contentious relationship between Colombian presidents, particularly the two last administrations, Juan Manuel Santos and Iván Duque, with their counterpart Nicolás Maduro in Venezuela, a contentious relationship that puts tension at the diplomatic level, at foreign policy levels, and of course at security levels. So in order to explain, why it fluctuates, I have to kind of mention these two moments. The first, the Colombian peace process. So we signed a peace agreement with FARC in 2016, and this helped improve to a certain extent relations with Venezuela, to the extent that Venezuela and Cuba were sponsors, were friends, were accommodating for the Colombian peace process. And actually all the negotiation process was done in Havana itself. Now, the process was closed, peace was signed. President Juan Manuel Santos put this to the test. It created a referendum in Colombia to accept or reject the peace agreement. And the outcome showed that about 50.2% of the Colombians who voted in the referendum were against the peace agreement, and 49.8% were in favor. So it's sort of our Brexit moment. It occurred also in 2016. And what it showed us, first of all, polarization. It showed, there's a disagreement and a support at the same time of what is being proposed to end the war with FARC. Also had to do with the support that leftist regimes and that Venezuela and Cuba had to this particular process. And because of the diplomacy crisis that this brought to the agreement back in 2016, and the close connection that it established with the Venezuelan regime and Cuba, then this issue was easily used by political opposition to the Havana Agreement, and it led immediately to tension straight at the border and a foreign policy tension between Juan Manuel Santos and President Maduro, which obviously had an immediate effect on the border. So despite the agreement having to do with legitimacy issues in Colombia, its foreign connections brought this new tension between President and President Maduro, and it sort of shows that the foreign policy issue also has a strong influence in how we approach locally this problem of migration. And the reality behind it, although it sounds like a really current event-based situation, the real structural issue is that there's a lack of protection of migrant rights, particularly in the first 2 years of this crisis, from 2015 to 2017. We are talking about issues of health, of labor, of documentation of migrants. And what we see in those early periods is a lack of policy, of legislation to deal effectively with this crisis. And what we see is temporary solutions, particularly the offering of a temporary residency, which only had a time frame of 2 years, which obviously has not been able to deal with the crisis, despite the fact Colombia has signed many international agreements stating that the Colombian state would defend and protect migrants' rights and refugee rights. Particularly, I mentioned in the paper the Mexico Declaration of 2004 and the Brazil Action Plan of 2014, both processes where Colombia leadership in discussing the importance of protecting migrants in the Americas. Can we move to the next slide? So my point with the rocky bits, so it shows a mixed response to the crisis, because as soon as there was this crisis and the peace agreement, then the measures were tightened at the border, so we were letting less immigrants in, and there was less political will to discuss more open solutions to the crisis. And at this point in 2017, we see a presidential campaign with a new candidate, Iván Duque, the current president of Colombia, that in the midst of the race decides to talk about Venezuela and talking about how important it is that we have a clear policy, that we have clear support for the migrants. And it sounds, at least in discourse, that the measures would be sort of made more flexible if he would become president. And effectively, he becomes president, and out of his campaign, what we have seen is certain moments where there has been this flexibilization, this opening up of policy and creating a more coherent policy about migrants in Colombia. But at the same time, the same type of foreign policy rifts against Venezuela that have dampened and have limited a real effect of a migration policy in Colombia. So in late 2017 and throughout 2018, President Duque opens up a strategy. He calls it the Assistance and Integration Strategy for Venezuelans. And it actually talks about two key points. It talks about access to the National Health Service for Venezuelans and the opening up of humanitarian services. That is, services based on the delivery of water, the creation of shelter places, and the establishment of sanitation regimes to help support Venezuelans in the country. And this comes also with what appears to be the strengthening of institutions in Colombia to deal with the Venezuelan crisis. So particularly the Ministry of Health and the Institute for Family Welfare have all opened policies and approaches to deal with Venezuelan migrants, particularly to incorporate Venezuelan children into the Colombian education system and to open up hospitals and the national health system to help with Venezuelans arriving in the country. Now, this seems, in my opinion, and based on what I'm starting to research, as an interesting yet short-term solution. Because one of the key problems here that is not being discussed is how to deal with the economy, how to integrate Venezuelans into the Colombian labor market. A labor market that is already affected by COVID-19, because we've seen a rise in unemployment figures. Right now, the latest report came out of January 2021. It says that our unemployment rate is around 17.3%. But the problem is not only unemployment, but the actual employment figure. What we're discovering is that around 58% of employment in Colombia is informal. So it is either people who have their independent businesses or people who are actually buying and selling stuff on the street. So the informal sort of street vendor type. Have our own challenges regarding employment, adding to the issue of how to incorporate Venezuelans, but it hasn't been very promising, both due to the pandemic and both to actually structural crisis of the economy here in Colombia. So as you can see, this is a very grim picture. And I think this photo that I chose shows the two things. You know, it shows the picture of the High Commission for Refugees talking about the importance of rights, but in the background, sort of this migration policy from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that is the base of the contradiction. A foreign policy that discusses a lot of what to do with Venezuela and being very aggressive in its stance against Maduro, and also trying to talk about supporting Venezuelans here in Colombia. And it seems that one and the other contradict, because the more the tension rises between President Duque and President Maduro, the more propensity we see in media and in policy circles to tighten or to make these measures to support immigrants more complex and more complicated. Okay, so to finish with this bit, with the political bits, Ivan Duque's foreign in the last 2 years has been really complex, and as I said, affecting the treatment of migrants. Duque has aligned himself with Trump and has been very insistent in international scenarios to denounce Maduro administration as a violator of human rights, of violating humanitarian law, of creator of the crisis. One of the big policies that Duque sponsored was the creation of a diplomatic blockade. So calling all countries to Venezuela to actually continue and sponsor an economic blockade of the country to cut sort of economic ties. And in policy has been deemed by many political commentators here in Colombia as a failure. Aligning with Trump has not brought any success for Ivan Duque. I mean, Maduro has not left power. The idea of removing him really quickly was not very realistic and did not occur. But at the same time, migrants have kept flowing into Colombia year by year and month by month. So in that sense, the diplomatic blockade and the tough stance against Venezuela, trying to relate to Trump's view of Venezuela, didn't really work. And of course, Trump, in the beginning of this year, by the end of his presidency, decided to change his stance towards Venezuela. In the beginning, he deemed the Maduro regime as narco-terrorist and illegal, illegitimate. But at the beginning of this year, he changed his rhetoric due to the failure of such policy. And he started talking about lifting some of the economic sanctions the US had on Venezuela. And at the same time, the Biden administration, although it's still in early stages, has commented on the need to evaluate and try to start effectively lifting some of those economic sanctions. So in that sense, those approaches have always ended in tightening the grip against Venezuelan migrants, controlling the border, and this has, of course, impacted the way in which the migration policy has been developed here in Colombia. Just to give you two insights on how the pandemic has also affected this. So in December last year, President Duque made a public statement saying that only those migrants that had either a legalized status or that had double nationality, that had the Colombian nationality, would actually receive the vaccines here in Colombia. Whereas around sort of, I would say 55% of the Venezuelans, of that migrant population, would be left out just by the fact that they had no legal status, or they had problems with their documentation. So in that sense, the discourse in December was really tightening the immigration approach, and it was really exemplary of sort of that very negative stance against the problem in Colombia. But then President Duque in February, by the end of February, changed again radically his stance, and he started saying that he is going to legalize all immigrants in the country, and he's going to grant them a temporary status that would last around 10 years. Now, this means that they would legally be allowed to work in Colombia, that they would have access to health and education systems, and that they would receive vaccinations just like the rest of Colombians. Now, this decision has been praised by the international community here, by the International Migrations Office, by the UNHCR, and it appears to be a landmark decision, something that's to be applauded. But at the same time, the decision here in Colombia has many detractors, and it has appeared to be very unpopular with people that are already criticizing the Duque regime for its very poor handling of the pandemic, very poor negotiating of the vaccines. So it actually leads to a critique of why Venezuelans are getting this when most Colombians have been struggling with the pandemic, and that the decisions have been really poorly made. So in that sense, despite being a landmark moment, I think due to the record of Duque's popularity in Colombia, and particularly his handling of the pandemic, this has not been very well accepted here within specific sectors, right? And this adds to the already problem of the fluctuating policy, because now we're bringing in the opinion of Colombians, of society, into the matters, and a stance that, as I'm about to describe, is not very friendly and can be rather hostile against migrants arriving in the country. So let's move to the next and final slide. The final slide relates to the last point, which is, if they're stuck between the rock and a hard place, then hard place has to do with Colombian society. It has to do with negative rhetorics and negative perceptions of Venezuelans here in the country, but it stems from a problem that I hope you can understand, and it has to do with our internal armed conflict. The conflict has made us into a divided, polarized country from many sides. We're polarized between left-wing and right-wing politics. We're polarized between perceptions of conflict between the urban and the countryside, and we're polarized because of our stance in sort of the social classes hierarchy here in the country. So in that sense, all these sort of divisions and all sort of these negative stances, either against the government or against proposals from illegal groups when they're in peace processes, have all affected Colombians. And in that sense, they've also affected this issue of migration, and it is closely related to peace processes and to relationships, our relation with Venezuela. And the key thing here, the key concept, is the arrival of xenophobia. Xenophobia as either a rejection, a discrimination, or violence against Venezuelan migrants in the country, coming from this polarization, from this divided society. And what I seem to be reading and hearing regarding this xenophobia in Colombia, it kind of stems from two discourses. One discourse that deems Venezuelans as victims of a leftist repressive regime. So it becomes an opportunity for a right-wing opposition to kind of highlight how bad Nicolás Maduro has been. But at the same time, that discourse gives very little agency to Venezuelans. They are perceived as these poor individuals that have got no agency and that are in constant need of charity, and that's why they're in Colombia. That's one of the sides of the discourse. The other is more problematic. It straightforward labels them as either criminals, prostitutes, or freeloaders seeking government handouts. And in that sense, what I get out of this blaming of Venezuelans and these different discourses is just that it's making them scapegoats from structural issues that Colombia has had for many, many decades regarding our social, economic, and political situation amidst conflict. And by this, I'm talking about issues of ongoing unemployment, the reduction of quality of life here, and sort of a perception of the country being very insecure, prone to violence, and prone to crime in different cities. So in that sense, the discourse is quite aggressive at the social level against Venezuelans. And it can be seen in a particular incident that I mentioned in the article. Very recently, the Colombian mayor, Claudia Lopez, has used a particular crime situation, a crime incident, where there was a shootout in downtown Bogotá, sorry. And her immediate statement was that it was by Venezuelans, and she literally said, first they kill us and then they rob us, denouncing sort of how insecurity has risen in the city, and kind of pointing towards Venezuelans as the causers of that rise of insecurity. Now, she said this amidst a call for support from the army and the police to reduce the levels of violence in Colombia, for the police to reduce the levels of crime that are happening here in Bogotá. But what is concerning is how she immediately hints at Venezuelans being the cause of this, whereas insecurity and these problems with crime have been in Bogota for many, many years prior to the arrival of Venezuelans over here. So in that sense, it's a point that they're becoming scapegoats, and it's very easy for mass media, for the communication channels here in Colombia, and even digital media and social media, for anyone to see that every time there's an announcement, a report on a crime, on a robbery, and a killing, there's an immediate focus on the nationality, the identity of the criminals, and kind of pointing, it's the Venezuelans. So in that sense, what I want to highlight is this issue of scapegoating, and scapegoating that kind of tries to hide the fact that we've got ongoing issues because of conflict, that these are not new events, the unemployment and the insecurity. It's just that now there's this perception that because Venezuelans arrived, that all these situations have increased. So as you can see, and kind of closing up this talk, the idea of Venezuelans being stuck between a rock and a hard place has to do with all these wide-ranging issues. It has to do with fluctuating migrant policy that depends on Colombia's relation with Venezuela and the president's approach to foreign policy. It also has to do with structural issues, our ongoing lack of policy, of legislation, of preparation to deal with migrants, with internally displaced persons, to deal with our own conflict, and at the same time how this polarization that comes out of our conflict now becomes the source of this very negative narrative against Venezuelans here in Colombia. And I think that's it. I should close with that remark. Scapegoating, divisions, and sort of a fluctuating policy. I say those would be the three messages behind this talk. And
Thank you so
I'll
much.
leave it at that.
That was really, really interesting. Thank you so much for all of that. So I'm going to ask a few questions to start with, and then we'll open up and anyone else can ask any questions if they have them. So the first question I had for you was, I guess, kind of geographical or maybe geopolitical, but obviously Venezuela doesn't only border Colombia. So I was wondering, are Guyana and Brazil also experiencing like an influx of migration, and other parts of South America experiencing a similar issue, or is it explicitly Colombia, and if so, why so?
Sure. No, I think the situation is lived similarly, particularly in Brazil, Panama, even countries that are not neighboring Venezuela but are here in South America. They're also experiencing the brunt of this crisis. They're not prepared. They're amidst economic crisis, they're amidst COVID crisis. So it's also a problem. I would say the difference of why Colombia might resonate is obviously it's the immediate neighbor. We're receiving more migrants, but obviously this context of violence that we have not solved our internal armed conflict, and those things spill over and move around. So the fact that dissidents of FARC and dissidents of ELN have moved to Venezuela, and now there's a conflict between the Venezuelan government and them, creating violence at the border, people moving over to Colombia, being Colombia also a very dangerous place in regards to this situation. So the dimensions bit more problematic here in Colombia because of our conflict, but Brazil is also having problems, Panama is also having problems, and this context, we have seen similar things to what have been occurring here in the social reaction to migrants. So it was very famous in a couple of Panamanians, the spreading of pamphlets telling people, we will give you money if you punch a Venezuelan, if you kick a Venezuelan, and Molotov bombs. This has happened here in Colombia, but also in other places. People throwing Molotov bombs to places that offer shelter to Venezuelan migrants, and sort of a very negative discourse. It's also built upon by politicians who kind of jump on this xenophobic wave to kind of denounce insecurity problems, denounce terrorism, denounce crime, and they all seem to have a reaction, which is we need to control migrants, we need to deal with this delinquency, and so they add on to some of the similar things that are happening here.
Thank you for that. Yeah, so you mentioned the hostile environment quite a lot, and I guess that's a term that we also hear in the UK and in a lot of the world at the moment. I guess I was wondering how that sort of manifests itself in Colombia specifically. And when you talk about polarization, who are the different poles? You know, is it educated, uneducated, class-based, race-based? Like, what are the sort of different ends of the spectrum that you were talking about?
Sure. Oh, polarization here is really complex. I mean, coming from Bosnia and Kosovo, I was able to understand ethnic divisions, but here, first of all, there are divisions related to the Colombian conflict. So there's a political discourse that recognizes that we have an internal conflict, that it has social economic causes, and that it needs to be dealt with by a solid negotiation, peace dialogue process, versus another discourse that says, no, what we have here is a terrorist issue, and what we need is to kill the terrorist groups, and in that way we would get peace in Colombia. Now that adds on to discussions about left-wing politics and right-wing politics, and those have to do with migrants. Those have to do with how we view Venezuela, if we can see Venezuela as someone to negotiate with, or if we see it as a terrorist state. And in that sense, that shapes people's perceptions about who Venezuelans are, if we see them as allies or if we see them as enemies or as threats. And particularly people seeking out Venezuelans that are against Maduro government, that they can also say that they're against left-wing political parties in Colombia. This is also meddled by differences between the urban sites and the rural sites. So urban Colombia has suffered more from terrorism, from car bombs and yeah, sort of terrorist attacks, versus the countryside that has seen proper ongoing war. So they have seen forced displacement and forced disappearances, takeovers from FARC. And in that sense, it feels like two different countries with two different realities. And of course, they view very differently both war in Colombia and both Venezuelans. To give you just a little example, and not to take this any further, the referendum to agree or disagree with the Colombian peace agreement in 2016, that difference that I marked between the 50.2 and the 48.2% difference between the no and the yes votes, there was a map at that time, and pretty much everyone who was supporting the peace agreement was in Colombia's rural areas, and the people that were against it were people victims of terrorism, mainly in the urban sites in the big cities here in Colombia. So in that sense, that also tells us a different perception of our own war and how we relate to Venezuelans. Now, it's a very different scenario for a Venezuelan arriving in small towns in Colombia like Arauquita, the place that I showed you, and a huge difference of having them here in Bogotá, which is a 10 million people city, with, you know, a range of internal conflicts from crime, from security issues that these migrants are now arriving in. And according to our public opinion, the discourse has been, oh, they're adding on to that, and now they are the ones to blame, you know, adding on that xenophobic sentiment that I was mentioning before.
Okay, one last question before I'll let everyone else ask theirs. So you talked about human rights quite a lot, and I was wondering the sort of correlation or connection between Colombia's past and your conflict then, and, you know, the documented human rights violations that are happening at the moment, particularly on the border and particularly against Venezuelan migrants. What sort of accountability processes are there? Like, does it connect to the transitional justice processes that have happened with conflict in the past? Is there sort of a hierarchy of conflict and which human rights are more important than others? And if Colombians are more important than Venezuelans in that sense, like how's that playing out?
Yeah, transitional justice seems to be the difficult step that we're taking right now after the Havana Peace Agreement. So to cut a very, very, very long story short, the Havana Peace Agreements offered a very, in my opinion, comprehensive package of transitional justice that combines punishment, so retributive justice, with reparations for victims, but also focusing on dialogue and telling the truth. So we've created a whole range of institutions that are trying to deal with those things. And these were presented by President Juan Manuel Santos to deal with the legacy of violence from 60, 70 years of conflict. Now we had a government change, and we had Ivan Duque being a president since 2018, and his stance has been, I would say, contrary or critical of what Manuel Santos offered to FARC and offer in transitional justice. So one of the key things that we have seen is Juan Manuel Duque not wanting to support, to finance a lot of work of transitional justice institutions in the country. But apart from that, which can be a political rift, what we see is institutions are working independently on whether they have the support from the government, and they have declared, our Truth Commission has stated a lot of cases regarding FARC's responsibility on kidnapping and the Colombian state's responsibility on what we call the false positives, which is a kind to simplify it, it was an action made by the army in between 2002 to 2010, where they would get very poor people from different backgrounds here in Colombia, offer them, take them in a truck, and then force them to wear guerrilla camouflage, then shoot them, and then present them as casualties of the war, saying, oh, look, we killed all these FARC leaders, when in fact what the people that were being killed were actual poor, honest civilians here in Colombia. So there's a huge criticism of how there's a rift between the government and the transitional justice institutions. And that in itself says a lot about our situation regarding human rights. Add to that the fact that Colombia right now is one of the worst countries for civil society human rights defenders, because we're still ongoing conflict and because we have a rise again in paramilitary violence. Paramilitary violence in Colombia has to do with right-wing groups that hold a similar view to the government but engage in war in different parts of Colombia. So they're responsible for mass displacement, for harassing and killing civilians, and they have targeted particularly civil society leaders. We call them social leaders here in Colombia, and most of these social leaders have also brought the attention on the need to help Venezuelans and deal with the migration crisis.
Okay, great, thank you for that. Is there any questions from anyone listening? Anyone wants to ask anything?
Yeah, we've got Alfie over there.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, hi Lou. I don't know if you can see me. You don't need to see me actually, you just need to hear me. So yeah, thanks very much for doing the presentation.
I don't know who's...
Sure. Can you see me now? No, okay.
I'm sorry, I can't see you. I can't see you, but I can hear you, yeah.
Okay, that's fine, that's fine. It's probably best. Yeah, so what I wanted to ask was, you linked a lot of the problems to Duque. Is that the correct pronunciation, the leader of Colombia?
Yeah, Duque.
So,
yeah.
Duque, sorry, yeah. So there's an election next year, and I guess there's an opportunity for somebody else to come into office, which I'm sure you really would like, by the sounds of what you've said. But even so, that's only a 4-year, it's only a 4-year term, isn't it? Which I believe to be the case. And something that I've wondered about migration in general, which is that a lot of the policies that are talked about as solutions would take more than 4 years. So I'm kind of wondering, even if the right outcome came about and the right party got into office, are there still going to be problems with just that 4-year period on implementing these things like education, structural problems, attitudes? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I agree with you in that sense. Bear in mind, Colombia has the figure of re-election. We've been having re-election for about, 8 years now, like constitutionally speaking. The current president is not going to be re-elected, and he has made it clear that he's stepping out of once his 4-year term is over, mainly because he's been heavily criticized, and there's sort of a legitimacy and an image crisis on his behalf. But going back to your point, I think my idea with the fluctuating responses to migrants have to do with lack of preparation. The Colombian state simply was not used to receiving migrants. We were used to expelling people because of our internal armed conflict. So this is the first time we're kind of receiving people and supporting them. We just don't have the tools, the legislation to do that. Now, as I said, Duque started presenting some policy offers. These have been processed and debated in Congress, but they all seem to be short-term. It's all about visas and residency permits. We have moved to get the education sector and the health sector on board, but that's not enough, and that can be easily changed with a new administration with a different stance. Even if Congress changes again, this could all, be moving to a different direction. So I think it's, as it tends to be with even peace policy in Colombia, it depends so much on the view of the political party that's in charge that it's still to continue fluctuating. And regardless of whether we are supporting or rejecting the Maduro administration, the migrants are going to keep coming in. That's the reality, that's the trend, and it doesn't seem to be stopping. And actually, the last 2 weeks with that Arauquita example, are a clear example that, look, now we have more refugees and we have more internally displaced persons coming to different towns. So it's at a huge moment of crisis right now. It will definitely be in the debate between political parties for the presidency, without a doubt, but I don't think that there's going to be a solution unless we start thinking as a state policy rather than a government by government policy. And I think that's what you're mentioning is one of the key problems of why we're so unprepared to deal with the crisis.
Great, thank you. So let's go on to the next question. We've got 2 people with raised hands. I'm going to go for Alice. You there to ask a question? Over to you.
Hey, yeah, can you hear me? I don't know.
All good.
Thank you so much. That was so interesting. It was actually fascinating for me in particular. I spent some time in Colombia recently, and I had spoke to a lot of friends about very similar issues. And my question was also related to the UK. I wanted to ask your opinion. It sounds like he's won popularity through his policy on migration from the international community, but it also seems to be it doesn't necessarily seem to be aligned with a lot of societal attitudes towards a massive Venezuelan migration at this time. Like, I kind of wanted to ask, what's in it for him? Like, what reason would he have to have what I've read as being a very compassionate, as often in a lot of articles, he's being hailed as presenting this really compassionate policy on migration, which, I definitely agree that there are benefits too, but I don't know. I just wanted to ask, what's kind of in it for him, would you say?
Sure. There has been clearly, in terms of handling his public image, a considerate change this year, because President Duque has been severely criticized for his handling of the pandemic, of the economic crisis, and his handling of the political crisis with Venezuela. So I think he has realized, first of all, aligning with Trump did not work. And now that there's a Biden administration, and bear in mind our foreign policy is historically irrestrictively aligned to the US, he's got to start playing his card in administration, albeit the fact that it might be a little too late. So in that sense, there's sort of this recognition like, well, okay, it was a failure. We need to shift the discourse, and we kind of have to figure out a way to shift the policy response. So he's trying to get the international community behind this, and it might be a relief for some Venezuelans. It might bring some positive effect, but it might be a case of too little too late, because again, if it can occur with Venezuela again, and if there's a different stance and a different tone in the region, Colombia will change the tone. I think the lack of unity between South American governments, and Colombia being one that tries to be very different from the subcontinent in the way we approach to Venezuela, is one of the key problems. The fact that we don't seem to kind of integrate in the region, but rather Colombia kind of depends on what the United States perceives as the solution or the measures to take. That is the key problem. And the Duque administration is an example of that. When Trump was really tough and tight against the Maduro administration, Duque had a discourse talking about this diplomatic blockade. And at the beginning of this year, changed his stance. Now Biden's even more less lenient on those tough measures, and Duque has kind of changed accordingly.
It feels like the impact is greatest for the Colombian people, and obviously for the Venezuelans as well, but the impact is on them. But for Duque, it's kind of he has the freedom to change sides, and without the impact really necessarily falling on him, but the people are the Colombian people are the ones who really feel it. That's a shame.
And especially, I want to bring inside what happened in 2018, maybe if I have enough time. In 2018, there was a huge talk here in the US of a possible invasion to Venezuela, right? So people were thinking, Trump was talking a lot about the need to gain the sympathy of Venezuelan military so that they would overthrow Maduro, or actually use Colombia as a middle ground to bring US soldiers here and figure out a way how to get into Venezuela. That was the talk of 2018, which is completely ridiculous. It would throw Colombia into an international war with Venezuela, something that we can't afford, having our own internal armed conflict, but also, a complete misread of the situation, because everybody was thinking, well, all we need to do is gain the sympathy of the military and end of story. And that didn't really happen. There were some military that rebelled. They tried something, they failed, and now they're here in Colombia seeking protection. Why? Because most of the military in Venezuela have been are becoming the heads of key economic institutions. They're the most profitable enterprises. So they're never going to overthrow Maduro in the way Trump wanted, because they have a huge reward. So in that sense, it was a complete misread here of the situation and of the policy. And Duque, this was the initial year of his administration, he just jumped right into that because he wanted to show his alignment to the Trump administration. And it was a ridiculous discourse by February, March, April 2018. Luckily, well, we didn't go to war. It was completely crazy. But the fact that Duque actually said in public opinion that it was a possibility and that we needed to act tougher against Venezuelans, but that said a lot.
Thank you very much.
Great. I think we've got another question from Andrew. Is that right, or have you done it accidentally?
Actually, it's from Sarah. I didn't put my name on the screen. Thanks very much, Louis. This has been really interesting, and you've done a great job in sort of shedding, for me anyway, a spotlight on a kind of issue that I'm vaguely aware of, but I just had no idea. So really, really interesting to hear about it. And it's obviously a really challenging situation and really complex in terms of the domestic politics and social attitudes and everything. And actually my question was going to be about the sort of international community and the US. So you've answered it a bit, but I'm just wondering, with the new US administration, kind of what position should the international community be taking, both the US or anybody else with any influence? What would be most helpful in this really, really difficult situation, to which there are clearly no easy answers? Thanks very much.
Yeah, but I think there's an obvious shift in discourse on a lot of issues that have to do with Colombia from the Biden administration. First of all, there has been, here local media has called it like calling the attention of the president, or like kind of being a little bit tougher, saying you need to respect transitional justice and you need to start supporting the peace agreements, something that Trump would have never said, right? Trump was more on the counterinsurgency, counterterrorism line, and Biden seems to say, no, let's look at the Colombian peace agreement as a way to deal with the Colombian crisis that can actually help the Venezuelan crisis. Because if we stop violence here, if we start negotiating with ELN, probably the situations at the border might be less prone to violence. It's not to say that it'll eliminate violence altogether, but it might reduce the tensions, hence have a better impact on Venezuelans moving over here. That's one of the key things. But the other, in regards to how the US wants to deal with Venezuela, although it's been just a few months, Biden has said that he has to revisit the sanctions, and he has to revisit the discourse, which was very Cold War-esque in terms of denouncing that Russia was arriving in Venezuela and that Venezuela had such an anti-US stance. And it's sort of a time to say, look, let's put these ideologies for a little while on the back burner and focus on the humanitarian crisis itself. There seems to be that voice, but unfortunately, geopolitical events can change really easily and can change that voice. So the fact that Maduro is still there, the fact that the crisis has not been resolved, that the humanitarian plan keeps going and going, it will be a foreign policy concern, both for Duque, who has to kind of change his stance and be more, receptive to these issues, and with the US, who is clearly in a tone of rethinking what Trump had done, the Trump discourse on the region, and probably trying to take a more dialectic, dialogue-prone, more peace-orientated approach, because clearly the sort of militaristic take is not going to be the solution.
Oh, thanks very much.
Great. Does anyone have any more questions or any comments or anything they want to ask Lou?
I don't think there's anything in the chat. I haven't checked the chat.
Oh yeah, you can type as well if you don't want to ask over Zoom.
Sorry, I definitely have a question, but I've now lost why I've written them, which is not helpful or very professional.
Am I right to jump in with a quick question?
Yes, go for it.
You mentioned that there was a kind of recent announcement that there would be steps to try and help Venezuelan migrants in Colombia access the COVID vaccine and have some sort of temporary access to healthcare during the pandemic. As far as you're aware, is there any kind of, how are they prioritizing that? So, you know, as I can imagine that if you were a Colombian citizen, that that might cause kind of further discourse if it's felt that migrants are getting kind of prioritized, or is there any, for example, are they saying that Colombian citizens would be prioritized first over migrants, or is it becoming a unanimous kind of age or comorbidity status that determines the order that people might have access to that kind of healthcare and vaccination program?
So there are two lines to respond to that. One is what has been the government's approach to dealing with the pandemic, and how has that approach been focused or not focused on Venezuelans in the country. So in the presentation kind of mentioned the discourse. In December, the stance of the government was only Venezuelans that are legalized in the country can have access to vaccinations, nothing for those who are deemed irregular, and now it has changed to all of them, right? The problem is the vaccination process. The negotiating the vaccines took a long time. It was fraught with many difficulties. And now that we're, since mid-February, early March, did we start to roll out vaccines here in the country, it's still very slow. And bear in mind, corruption has heavily affected the delivery of vaccines, and the health system is not fully prepared. There's a difference between private health companies and the public state-based system for dealing with these things. So there are a lot of irregularities there. Now, the stance has been that we should take everyone who's legal in the country in the same way, and the priority has been for people who are 80 years of older to receive the first set of vaccines. Now we're talking about the people who are from 60 to 80. But if you compare it with the region, Colombia is doing really, really bad. We're delivering vaccines really slowly. We're like the 9th or 10th country in the region in terms of effectiveness of vaccination. And putting into perspective, Chile, which is the example here, and has been very quickly rolling out vaccines, and the figures I think are around 17 or 18% of the population within just a few weeks. In Colombia, within a very similar time frame, we've only touched closely to 1.2% of the population. So things here are really, really slow, and the priorities seem to shift, and sort of corruption takes over. Vaccines being stolen, or vaccines, the money for vaccines, the aid money for supporting health here in Colombia seems to disappear from time to time. And it creates an additional burden to this vaccination of Colombians and Venezuelans.
That was really interesting. Thank you. I say, Ella, you're unmuted. Did you want to ask something? I was going to ask an unrelated question.
Go ahead.
I feel much more educated having listened to your talk, but I'm definitely not an expert. So this might be a bit of a stupid question, but looking at the bigger picture, as you can do maybe if you're not so well informed, and thinking about solutions, are there any countries or situations that you can take maybe positive experiences from that have managed to deal with crises like this? Obviously, this is such a unique situation, as you've explained so well, but are there any examples that could give some sort of hope for the future?
You're asking someone who studies transitional justice, and it's very hard for people like me to, I'm not saying I'm a pessimist, but it's hard to find the answer. I would say, rather than examples, there are windows of opportunity that occur here in Latin America that are very important and that we've somehow missed and that we need to look into details. So for instance, the fact that Venezuela and Cuba were supporting the Colombian peace process, that was a chance for us to deal with our problems with Venezuela, to say, look, actually, we know you have a friendly stance. Let's negotiate all our issues, diplomatic issues, boundary issues, economic issues, and it could have been a moment. Also, the fact that Venezuela, during the Chavez administration, was sort of the leftist governments in the region. That was the leftist wave of Latin America in the early, from 2005 onward. It was also an opportunity. Unfortunately, it got eaten by corruption in many cases, and it was a lost connection point between Bolivia, Peru, Venezuela, Ecuador, who took a different policy stance for a while, and it was quite interesting. But unfortunately, it wasn't, for me, it's not an issue of whether socialist approaches or neoliberal or right-wing approaches are right or wrong. The problem is corruption, right? So whether you're a left or a right-wing politician, if you buy sort of this clientele networks and the bribes and the usual corruption, well, it's not going to go anywhere regardless of whether you're left and right. And I think we lost that. We lost that opportunity of dealing with this problem by uniting and talking to Venezuelans. But Colombia always has had to be, you know, the kind of different way, following what the US kind of projects towards the subcontinent and kind of being that very negative, you know, denouncing Venezuela within the Organization of American States, denouncing Venezuela, talking about Maduro having to go to the International Criminal Court. And it feels like we can't connect with the rhetoric within the country. And the only connecting point, the connecting politician, is Bolsonaro in Brazil. And well, we know, you know, what is happening with him over there, the critique, the poor handling of the pandemic, the poor handling of the Venezuelan crisis in Venezuela, in Brazil, sorry. So it's not a good ally to have if we want unity within the subcontinent, to be honest.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, that's that's interesting. Thanks for answering that. So yes, not so much hope, but Alice, did you have a final question? Your hand is not raised anymore.
No, sorry, my hand was still up.
I'm sorry.
You've answered all of our questions. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's been so eye-opening and also really accessible. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
The pictures were great. I've got to say that really made a difference.
Yeah.
I was wondering where you got them from, actually.
Sorry, I
was wondering where you got
connection broke.
The pictures from the slide.
Oh, right. These are just from, I mean, somewhere from the International Crisis Group, another one's from Colombian media. There are very, very good photographers here located in Cucuta, in the city that is receiving most of the first entry of migrants. And there's a lot of great photographic, artistic work being done there because it's the area of the most evident tension in Colombia.
One to watch out for. Well, also thank you everyone for attending and giving up a whole more than an hour of your evening on a relatively sunny day in the UK. Obviously not everyone here is in the UK. And thanks to fellow editor Ella for being the lead on this. I think she did a really great job. So maybe we can all virtually clap for, obviously, first Lou for that wonderful talk and for being so generous with his time. And for answering all our questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
No, thank you all.
A lot. And it's a really important topic. So yeah. And thank you again to Ella for hosting this. And yeah, reminder that we are the Morocco Bound Review, and we are posting articles weekly, including Lou's, which actually would be a great one to read if you haven't read it already. That's up on the main page. It's moroccoboundreview.co.uk, and we hope to have talks like this monthly. So stay tuned. And thanks again to Lou. And I'll probably end this meeting now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.